So someone recently responded to my video taking Brotherhood down a peg, and today I'm gonna respond to that response video. The YouTuber in question is a fellow named Lunaticthegame. I don't condone anyone harassing this YouTuber, and I encourage everyone to keep all comments civil. Let's begin. Lunaticthegame begins his response by laying out some background information on the FMA series, and by sharing his personal opinions on the manga and both adaptations. As we don't have to cover all that in my video, we'll cut to where he starts offering counter arguments to mine. Oh, Brotherhood, nowadays if somebody makes a video discussing your flaws in a raw and unfiltered way, or if an O3 fan makes a post explaining why they prefer O3 to you, and without including the obligatory phrase, I like both adaptations, their video/post will likely get bombed with dislikes right out of the gate, and that just stinks.
Okay, so, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't possibly a thing that happens, but I'd like to imagine that this isn't nearly as true as you act like it is. I mean, it's not like you do anything more than just show 2 videos of people saying Brotherhood is trash and overrated.
Now, while I personally wish I'd used a wider pool of visual examples during this part of my video, I think you misunderstood the overall purpose of my intro here, which wasn't meant to prove to people that Brotherhood-related backlash was a thing. That would have been a topic for a whole other video entirely. And I think a good number of FMA fans in general, rightly or wrongly, already believe that it is a thing though, and the purpose of my intro was to anticipate and preemptively short-circuit potential Brotherhood-related backlash so that viewers could focus on the arguments provided after this disclaimer shows up. There is no shame in liking Brotherhood. I am simply sharing my opinion on the show, as well as debunking some misinformation related to it that I've seen come up again and again in various online discussions. I hope that what I say here can be of some value to you, whether you're a Brotherhood fan or an O3 fan, or maybe you just don't care. Also, there are going to be a lot of spoilers for all of FMA. Everything after this disclaimer is what I was arguing for, and at times trying to convince people of. Everything before the disclaimer is boundary setting around the main discussion, where I got a potential hurdle out of the way to try to give the main arguments a chance. How valid the Brotherhood backlash thing is in the first place is worth looking into, but it was beyond the scope and the goal of that original video.
Speaking of those videos, I got curious and looked them up. The first video was long gone as I couldn't find it, but I did find the second video, and I feel like the reason people disliked the shit out of it had less to do with the fact that it was shitting on Brotherhood, more so that it called it overrated, and the reasons for it were simply, I don't like the comedy.
The humor was just a bit much for me. It got to the point where I got a little annoyed.
Which is fair if not subjective, and then, I don't like the music.
The soundtrack wasn't memorable by any means, which, in my opinion, can make or break a show if it's not up to standard. Here's a test. I want you to name a track from the show and hum the melody. Opening and ending songs do not count.
And he also kind of assumes that everyone will agree with him that FMA Brotherhood doesn't have a memorable soundtrack, which sure as hell doesn't explain why much of the soundtrack has over 500,000 views on YouTube. Trish's Lullaby sits at 9 million views currently, by the way. So, yeah. People were probably nettled because people might see these 2 issues as being really minuscule compared to, arguing why the plot is maybe overrated, why the characters are a bit overrated, something along those lines. This video goes over 2 small things, and that's really it. So I can see why people maybe didn't like this video.
Not that this really matters for the reasons I just went into, but I rewatched MMCA Productions' video, and those aren't the only 2 issues he lists for disliking Brotherhood. He also says the following, which is a much bigger concern.
Overall, I probably won't remember anything except the flaws, 1 or 2 fight sequences, this intro, and that.
Needless to say, not finding anything in a show memorable except for its flaws, 1 or 2 fight sequences, an intro song, and a plot twist 4 episodes in is actually a pretty big reason to dislike it. While this criticism isn't explored like the other ones are, the sample clip I played does show that the YouTuber's overall problems with the show aren't limited to disliking the comedy and the music, which I'm afraid is the impression some people watching your video may get. I'm not saying that there was an intent to mislead here, I personally think there wasn't, but I thought I should chime in on this in case people do get the feeling I described earlier. Again, this doesn't really matter, I just thought I should point it out.
At least call the video my 2 biggest issues with FMA Brotherhood or something like that. Maybe people would be a little less nettled if you said that. I think it says a lot that this video here doesn't have nearly the same amount of backlash as the 2 videos you showed, despite you railing on Brotherhood so hard in this one. Gee, it's as if not titling your video Brotherhood is the worst anime or overrated makes people less inclined to immediately get up in arms.
Sure, maybe the title is a little less hyperbolic, but in the thumbnail I'm straight up depicting Brotherhood Ed as a pompous and unjustifiably arrogant buffoon, while O3 Ed stands unimpressed by whatever superiority the former claims to have. Also, my tone throughout the video itself itself was pretty darn negative, unlike MMCA's, which was super softball and civil. I feel that all of this nullifies your point about how being confrontational affects reception. I highly suspect that phrasing things the way that I did in my intro protected my video from being bombed with backlash, because in my intro I made a pretty sizable and elaborate speech about how if the relatively few but very toxic Brotherhood fans mass disliked my video simply because I held an outright negative stance on that show, they'd only be proving my point and making themselves look unreasonably petty. I think my tactic, if you can call it that, worked, and thankfully the very mature, untoxic Brotherhood fans who've interacted with me since I uploaded that video have been very kind and receptive to what I have to say.
Hell, even your video about 03 isn't hated despite not giving any love to Brotherhood. I wonder why. It's almost like simply hating on Brotherhood isn't actually the issue for quite a bit of these fans.
My 03 video was mainly about 03, not about criticizing Brotherhood, so I think that's the reason the video wasn't negatively received, because the main point of it was to praise 03, and it's one of the more outright positive videos on my entire channel.
I do feel like there could be some better examples of Brotherhood fans actually getting butthurt over people simply having opinions on it that are a bit critical, or say, Brotherhood fans being upset that anyone dare not like it as much as them. But as far as actual information given in this video, I'm left with a feeling that this is nothing but nonsense. Would it be fair if I argued the only reason people like this video and your video dedicated to 03 are because 03 fans are jealous of Brotherhood's success? No, I don't have any real proof that that's the case aside of the fact that people watched it and loved both of these videos. All you're doing is making hasty assumptions, and I'll be the first to tell you that without anything solid, it's just annoying.
You can be annoyed, that's your right, and again, I do think that this would be a topic worth exploring for someone out there, but as I said before, it was out of scope and mostly irrelevant for the main bulk of my video beyond what I said about it before. Now, before I respond to this next bit, I would like to say ahead of time that Lunatic the Game is going to characterize me as quote-unquote parading my interpretation of a certain interview as fact, despite the times you can clearly hear me say the words might and may in the original video, but I've recently found that it may also be based on false assumptions, meaning that the least liked part of the definitive FMA anime likely wasn't rushed on purpose to fill a quota or whatever, production concerns that, as I went into, possibly didn't concern the studio at all. I just thought I should give you guys a heads up about that because I never said that the interview in question or my interpretation of it 100% definitively proved my point. I never said you couldn't find information out there that couldn't conflict with or recontextualize what I said. I was just trying to show that at the time that I made the video, there was more solid evidence for my stance than evidence against it. That's it. Having said all that, I think what Lunatic the Game is going to say in response to my interpretation of the interview is shaky in its reasoning still, based only on that interview itself, because again, I never said my stance on this was definitive, nor do I think it matters much because I'd argue that either way, whether Brotherhood rushed its beginning for meta reasons or handled those episodes ineptly because it honestly thought it was doing a good job, or for whatever reason, those episodes are still bad and the series looks bad for making them like that. So even fans of Brotherhood consider its first core to be the weakest part of it, and I agree with them. But I found that a lot of folks tend to excuse the quality of these episodes with the reasoning that since the series was the second adaptation of the manga, Studio Bones naturally wanted to rush to the parts of the source material that the first adaptation didn't cover, and that was a legitimate strategy, or at least an understandable one on their part. Now, in my video, FMA 2003 is actually brilliant, by the way, go check that out if you haven't already. I briefly went into why this reasoning is deeply flawed when taken on its own merits, but I've recently found that it may also be based on false assumptions. In a 2017 interview with Anime News Network, Brotherhood series director Yasuhiro Airi went on record saying that the existence of the 2003 series didn't actually influence his creative choices on the new one at all. He says, and I quote, "The first Full Metal Alchemist anime came out in 2003 and became a huge hit. Then I got the offer to direct the next series that would coincide with the end of the manga series, and at that point I already knew how famous Full Metal Alchemist was. However, that didn't influence or affect me in the way I was going to make the series, so it really didn't prompt me to do anything different from what I've always done." The interviewer then asks him there wasn't any kind of pressure, and he answers by saying there wasn't pressure for me, but I was just approaching it in the same way as I usually do for any other title that I direct. I was more concerned about what would best suit this title in animation. So to be clear, according to the leading member of Brotherhood's production staff, the existence of FMA 2003 wasn't taken into account during the making of its younger, supposedly shinier sibling, meaning that the least liked part of the definitive FMA anime likely wasn't rushed on purpose to fill a quota or whatever, it was just simply made that way.
I've been trying to find ways to word this for like an hour, but honestly, I think I'll just come out and say this. I think you might be possibly misinterpreting this, or at least assuming what this means. That sounds a bit ridiculous if you read off the article, but think about the wording and the implications here. He talks about how his approach to directing FMA Brotherhood wasn't affected by the existence of 03, but this could just be referring to how he approached simply directing in the areas of tone, style of animation, etc.
This is such a weird way to interpret those words. If Brotherhood's director only meant what he said to apply to specific areas like tone and style, then he would or should have specified that, because otherwise that's not what those words mean. Even if only 10% of his work was influenced by what O3 did, to flat out say that he wasn't influenced would be misleading at best. But we're not just talking about a 10% figure here, we're talking about something as huge as the show's pacing. For an entire half season's worth of story, I don't think Irie would have simply forgotten to mention the obviously minor detail that he rushed the first 13 fucking episodes of his show because of another show's existence. That just wouldn't make sense, at least not based on this interview alone.
Well, it could be possible that this also meant that he was behind the way the early Brotherhood episodes were handled. There's also a possibility that he wasn't the person who made this decision. That could have easily been something the producers or writing team decided themselves, and the director simply had to go along with it.
Sure, but based on the interview alone, that's entirely speculation on your part, especially when you consider the question just under the one I read, where Irie explicitly says the manga was the main creative guide for the entire production outside of Arakawa, like showing up for some meetings for the first few episodes, which is the only exception he ever mentions.
I feel what I'm saying is a bit of a what if here, but I also feel at the same time what you're trying to say fits the same bill of being a what if I mean.
What? My interpretation is much closer to a literal face value reading of that quote than the one you presented. Irie said that the first adaptation didn't prompt him to do things differently when working on Brotherhood, so I concluded that it didn't. He said the manga was basically the sole creative influence for the production, so I concluded that it was. Your interpretation was one, that he was influenced by O3, even if only by a little bit, which he said he really wasn't, and two, that other members of the production were influenced by O3, which there's no positive evidence for in those quotes, and which Irie's statements about the manga positively imply isn't true. Also, I know that my reading isn't an odd, unlikely out there interpretation because a highly upvoted, sticky post by one of the moderators of the FMA subreddit shares my interpretation at the current time, and that sub favors Brotherhood by a wide margin. I'm bringing this up not to prove that I'm right, but to prove that the way I interpreted this interview is immediately apparent to other people who look at this interview.
You could at least treat it as such instead of parading it around like a fact that Brotherhood was being rushed because the director just wanted to do it like that.
May also be based on false assumptions.
Because of this, we're watching characters who should be memorable, but aren't until quite a ways into the story. Why should I care that Havoc gets paralyzed? I barely knew the guy. Does it matter if Maria Ross apparently dies here? Because Brotherhood cared so little about her, it didn't even give her a proper introduction. If this had happened in 03, there would be reason to feel sad, because she serves as Ed's mother figure and becomes a pretty strong supporting character.
It's undeniable that Maria Ross didn't have the same amount of screen time in Brotherhood, nor the same role as she did in 03 during Brotherhood. But in spite of all that, I don't really agree with what you're trying to suggest here. Last I remember, their introduction was more or less the same between both versions, given they showed up with little fanfare in both variations of the story.
The two introduction scenes for Maria Ross are only more or less the same if you're reading dry one-sentence summaries of them on Shmoop, but they're markedly different in terms of their dramatic effect. You know, the thing that matters most when assessing the artistic merits of narrative art. Look at this close-up shot from 03 that eases the audience into her point of view, and Ed and Maria's small interaction followed by lingering shots of Maria Ross up close. These short but emotionally charged shots not only provide windows into Maria's thought process, but they also set the tone for her initial relationship with Ed and kick off a mini arc for the two of them. If you look at other narrative mediums like literature and film, it's this kind of under-the-hood emotion-based storytelling that differentiates a dramatically functional story from either a plot description or a plot description with some production values. It's this kind of storytelling that a surprising number of times is either non-existent or handled with a stunning poverty of imagination or artistic inspiration in Brotherhood, even when that show isn't rushing, and it's this kind of storytelling that's overflowing in 03 with some spillover even in some of that show's weakest moments. Hey guys, this was where I was going to bring up Brotherhood's version of Maria Ross's intro scene so I could show how it lacks the kind of thing I'm talking about, but something happened when my brother pulled up the relevant episode for me on Crunchyroll. When we got to the scene of Ed standing in front of the burnt remains of the military library's central branch, my brother turned to me to share a brief, jokey comment. Upon looking back at the TV, he was astonished to see Ed and Al on a car ride with Maria Ross and Brosh, who in that viewing seemed to him to appear out of thin air. You want to know why that happened? Because the scene where Ross and Brosh first meet Ed, in between the bits where my brother was paying attention, is like 5 seconds long. So no, in terms of their dramatic effect, which is what we're talking about, or should be talking about here since Lunatic is responding to my comments on these characters' dramatic effectiveness, Maria Ross's intro scenes aren't more or less the same, even on a surface level.
However, we learn more about their characters through their reactions to the events they're faced with. It goes without saying, 03 gave her a much larger role. In 03, when Ed considers giving giving up on the Philosopher's Stone hunt, she encourages him to keep going. When Ed is at his lowest, most destructive point in that part of the story, she reaches out and helps him. By contrast, in Brotherhood, she isn't given nearly as much of a focus and isn't as integral to Ed and Al's goals, but does slap Ed, like in 03, for disobeying orders and going off on his own.
Yeah, Maria Ross does slap Ed in Brotherhood, and that would be a great moment for the two of them if they had any kind of relationship prior to this moment outside of a more or less professional one.
However, this isn't necessarily a matter of their introduction, but their role in the story.
When I said the thing about the introduction scene, I wasn't making the point that the introduction was the main problem. I was implying that Brotherhood's lack of a proper introduction is indicative of a more general lack of care Brotherhood takes when handling its characters. Whether you agree with that is another discussion, but Lunatic phrases his response in a way that makes it seem like he thinks my main problem with Maria Ross was her introduction scene, when that was just one of the problems I had with the show's approach to character.
That being said, who says we don't care about her likely death in spite of that? Ross has shown that, while a little overbearing, she cares about the brother's safety, and lended herself to many good interactions with the main cast.
Now, I was confused when I heard this, because I think that when Lunatic described Brotherhood's Maria Ross as overbearing, he was mixing up Brotherhood's characterization of Maria Ross with 03's or the mangas, because in Brotherhood, the slap scene he mentioned earlier is the only scene where Maria interacts in a personal way with Ed before her staged death sequence. But without the prior context from 03 where that show non-verbally conveys to the audience that Ed feels that Ross is overbearing, the slap scene in Brotherhood could just as easily be seen as Ross giving Ed a perfectly justified reality check after he did something really dangerous, and that's it. There aren't that many layers to her actions. She's as much of a blandly good-natured bodyguard side character as she was before that moment, and to address the point about her having many good interactions with the cast, the only interactions she has before her fake death are brief, 1 or 2 line exchanges with minor characters outside of the Elric brothers.
While their role in the story is downplayed in Brotherhood, it shouldn't be hard for many audience members to still be with Ed and be enraged when Roy apparently kills her, given she was innocent and a really good person.
Yeah, but here's the problem. I never argued that the scene would have absolutely no impact on anyone but me, only that I had no reason to feel sad when I saw it. As that disclaimer makes clear, I'm doing a lot of opinion sharing throughout the video. When it comes to any arguments I was actually making, dunking on Brotherhood's take on Maria Ross wasn't even the main reason I said what I did in the original video. I talked about Maria Ross and Jean Havoc within the context of a larger point about how Brotherhood's approach to its first 14 episodes harmed its cast, and about how whether or not you're doing it because a prior version of your show exists, rushing the first 20% of your story is an objectively bad creative decision that harms your cast and by extension any scene involving them.
Sure, her role in 03 likely would have made the scene even more impactful for both Ed and the audience, but that's not to say that the lack of it takes away the scene's impact in Brotherhood.
By saying what he said about 03's more thorough and careful sense of characterization potentially adding to the impact of certain scenes in Brotherhood, Lunatic implicitly agreed with the main point I was making here while disagreeing with a point that I didn't make.
On the other hand, we have Havoc, who similarly doesn't have anything incredibly story-related going on in Brotherhood, though, to be fair, if I recall correctly, it's no different in 03.
Except there's never a point in 03 where the audience is supposed to care about something irreversibly tragic happening to Havoc. That's why I don't have a problem with Havoc's comparatively small presence in 03, while I do have a problem with his comparatively small presence in Brotherhood.
But we're still given ample time to get to know him, see that he's a pretty chill and likable guy, all topped off by his role in getting Maria Ross out of a mistress. We're given plenty of time to really find his character pleasant before he gets really paralyzed and sidelined. I understand if you don't feel enough is done to get us to care, but I think outside of your perspective, it's fair to reason that enough is done with his character. Could more be done? Of course, but that's not to say there's no reason to care about Havoc by that part of the story.
You and other people might connect to what happens in the screen time that he's given, but to say we're given plenty of time to learn about him as a character and as a person is... I don't think that's true. In fact, while working on this very video, I combed through all of Brotherhood's episodes leading up to the 3rd laboratory mini-arc, and out of all of Havoc's appearances, the only ones that conveyed distinct personality traits or that gave him an important role in a story event add up to 1 minute and 40 seconds. Now, if you add up the runtime of all of Havoc's appearances, regardless of what he does in them, you do get a much bigger number in 8 minutes and 56 seconds, but here's the thing. I'm being extremely generous with those numbers, considering for a good portion of the time I recorded, he wasn't even on screen, he was just in the room somewhere. When it comes to the rest of the time, Do you guys want to know what he does during the rest of that time? He does things like saying, "Yoki, who's that?" and lifting a fucking tarp. To illustrate how meaningless all of these other appearances are and how generous I'm being by even mentioning them, he might as well have been a potted plant that just happened to be within the frame when the camera was pointing at a more important character. Don't act like I was baselessly saying what I did in my original video. There very clearly was a reason for my stance. The worst part is that I know, or highly suspect, that Lunaticthegame didn't go through all 18 of these episodes to back up his arguments, because if he did, he would have noticed this. And to those of my viewers who feel that what happened in the minute and 40 seconds of meaningful screen time Havoc had was enough to get them invested in his character, that's fine. But again, I didn't argue that his paralysis would have absolutely no effect on some people. I brought up Havoc and Maria Ross as examples of the cast suffering because of how ineptly Brotherhood handled its first 14 episodes, as well as to argue that if the series didn't rush the shit out of its beginning, big scenes involving those characters would have been more impactful, a point which Lunaticthegame, again, implicitly seems to agree with when you closely examine his logic.
Speaking of 03, a lot of people love criticizing the whole alternate universe plot point from the original series.
Maybe because it was stupid or something.
Saying it's nonsensical, and it is, but it is thematically relevant to the show, whereas an even more ridiculous scene from Brotherhood is never criticized simply because it's from Brotherhood. I'm talking about the end of Ed's fight with Pride, when he literally goes inside of the homunculus by turning himself into a Philosopher's Stone. This is really bad, and it raises a lot of questions too. Like, how the hell did he figure out that he could turn himself into a Philosopher's Stone? How the hell can he turn himself back? How come none of the sacrificed souls, like the alchemist who worked with Dr. Marco specifically, and who were transmuted into other Philosopher's Stones, tried turning themselves back after they were
Full Metal Alchemist.
This would be a really good point if I didn't think about it for like 2 minutes and then looked online for answers. Turns out, the scene makes a lot more sense than you give it credit for. Ed figured out that he was able to turn into a Philosopher's Stone during episode 41 when he was in the process of healing himself after removing a steel beam from his body. While in the painful process of doing it, he says,
"As soon as it's out of me, I'll close up the wound with alchemy."
What? Have you ever performed any kind of medical alchemy before?
Sort of. I did some research on it. When I tried human transmutation, I'm gonna have to use my own life force, the same way I would use a stone. That's it! I'm a Philosopher's Stone that's powered by a single soul!
before managing to fix his organs because of that. Since Philosopher's Stones are made up of human souls, he likely figured out that he could use his own soul to fuel transmutation. The likely reason that Ed is probably the first person to be able to pull this off is simply because he's incredibly gifted and one of the few alchemists to understand the composition of a Philosopher's Stone. Now, understandably, all of this is stuff that the story maybe perhaps could have built upon a little better, since Ed's brief comment is the only bit of build-up we get to something like this being possible, but if we're simply talking about how something like this even makes sense, it does. The series at least established how and why.
After I uploaded the original video, some commenters did chime in on my take on that scene, and what they wrote convinced me that Ed turning himself into the Philosopher's Stone does make sense within the logic that Brotherhood had previously established. But the part of my original criticism that's a lot less certain, and that you didn't respond to here, is the bit where I questioned how Ed transmuted himself back into a human when other alchemists used as ingredients for other Philosopher's Stones, such as Marco's assistants, weren't able to, which as far as I know, isn't explained. Having said all that, I still have issues with this scene that justify me using it for the comparison in my original video, and I'll go into these issues later. Also, I take issue with what you say next. In the next clip, you say that I mainly offer subjective criticisms for Pride's death scene.
And the scene just looks stupid. You see a naked Ed popping out of a hole and gives this ridiculous scream. Just everything about this moment. It's laughable. The way that the triumphant music plays over it, with Salim explaining what Ed just did, and the way that Kimberly, a psychopathic war criminal, just sits in the back of Salim's soul with a dopey smile on his face and says, "That means you never understood Edward Elric." I know this is supposed to be a big moment for Ed, showing how noble he is and all that, but it's conveyed in the cheesiest, dumbest way possible.
I mean, if you think it looks stupid because of all those elements, fine, but is this really an objectively awful scene? A lot of the problems you have with it, such as how goofy it looks, is really just subjective fluff.
Firstly, I want my viewers to remember my disclaimer from my original video. Secondly, setting that disclaimer aside, I have a problem with using this tactic of saying, well, that's just subjective, and thinking that's enough to just dismiss everything I'm saying. Because a lot of art criticism is subjective, and if you're gonna bother making a response to anyone's criticism of something, pointing that out doesn't really mean anything.
And, you know, that's valid. If you don't like how the scene is presented, that's fine, really. But really, the elements you don't like here are nothing really objective. This is just you saying, the scene looks goofy as fuck, when the presentation of the scene can equally add to what's happening, Ed overcoming Pride and defeating him.
Sure, you can phrase my problems with this scene in a way that sounds stupid, just like like I can phrase some people's problems with the Phantom Menace as there's too much talking or there's too much politics, and make them look like ideophobic Philistines, but to those who want to understand what I'm saying, it's clear I'm expressing a problem with the scene's presentation, namely that certain elements within the scene ruin the tone that the scene as a whole is aiming for. And if you're gonna respond to that, then you can't just wave it away because most works of art are only as good as their execution. Even people who believe that there's no objectivity in art criticism probably believe that talking about why a scene fails to capture its intended tone is the closest thing to objectivity that art criticism can even have. Unless we're talking about plot holes, but most critics think that plot holes are much less important than dramatic impact and aesthetic values. While I did phrase my complaints in a simple and comedic way, if you think about why I responded to the scene in the way that I did, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that I felt the scene's handling of the tone didn't match the importance of the scene in the story. I'm gonna go into more detail about this in my response to the next clip.
Also, I should point out your other complaints, such as Pride explaining what Ed just did. I mean, look, if it was super obvious what Ed was doing here, I wouldn't blame you for finding that dumb, but remember, the Ed realizing that it was possible to do this was barely established, as I've already explained. Plus, it's not like Pride's dialogue is simply him explaining what's happening, it's him being baffled that Ed could even do it in the first place.
Impossible! He's turned himself into a philosopher's stone and now he's forcing his way inside me!
On the other hand, yes, Kimberly, a psychopathic war criminal, shit talks Pride and hypes up Ed as all of this is happening. Remember, it's because while Kimberly is a psychopathic war criminal, he lives by certain rules, and seeing Pride, who considered himself above humans because he's a homunculi, try and take Ed's human body because he's in a pinch in spite of how he felt about humans, made him interfere because he saw that as Pride going against his word. I should also add that Kimberly is not giving off a dopey smile that is an evil grin.
Yeah, I know it's an evil grin, and my problem isn't that Pride explains what Ed did, period. My problem is with how the show presents Pride's explanation. The scene intends to make Ed look clever and badass for using a homunculus's physical and spiritual makeup to his own advantage, but as you yourself say, the show didn't optimally build up the mechanism of how Ed accomplishes this, so I have a hard time buying that Ed is clever at all. In terms of dramatic buildup, it feels like the divine screenwriter planted that knowledge into Ed's brain. This is where I'm gonna segue into tone. The way I phrase things in my original video may lead people to think that my main issues with the scene are logical problems, but I want to make it clear that it's actually the tone that's the main issue for me, as it pulled me out of the moment and possibly led me to notice the logical problems in the first place. For example, what's the tone of Kimberly's character? It's a black abyss of cruelty with only the coldest set of ideals acting as his moral framework. What's the tone of Pride's character? It's dread, horror, the feeling of encountering something alien, otherworldly, Lovecraftian like impossibility. Lastly, what is the tone of the scene that sends these characters off? Triumphant heroism with some screw you energy mixed in. I believe that even if a character does something that's consistent with who he is, his actions can still feel at odds with the overall tone of the scene surrounding him. You can argue that it's in character for Kimberly to say something like, "That means you never understood Edward Elric," but the presentation surrounding him, especially the choice of music dominating the audio track, gives his line a much dopier, cheesier feel than it would in most other scenes involving that character, hence why I use the word dopey to describe Kimberly here. That's what I was responding to. The presentation makes it feel like Kimberly is more interested in affirming Ed's goodness than in screwing over Pride, even if I know in my mind that this isn't the case. I can make a similar complaint about Pride here. The idea that this living embodiment of existential terror and dread can feel genuine fear at what a much less powerful human being can do to him might be in character on paper, but the poor dramatic buildup of how Ed takes Pride down, as well as Ed's sudden nudity and whack-a-mole-like entrance through a glowing portal, while the most stereotypically heroic Hollywood score plays in the background, makes Pride's reaction and fear feel laughable, given what we've seen of his power and cruelty up until this point.
This scene ultimately has a lot more than you give it credit for, and personally works much better than that scene you compared it to from 03. I can list a couple of reasons people don't complain about this scene, such as how emotionally cathartic it is, and Kimberly's unnecessarily badass send-off. By comparison, the real world is on the other end of the gate plot twist from 03 gets strangled by a myriad of issues, such as having little foreshadowing, given most if not all of it was brief references to real-world events such as witch trials and the plague, all of which came mere episodes before it happened. The fact that the plot twist is given little time to be explored, since it happens in the penultimate episode, and is given a short half an episode to be explained before Ed is sent back to his world, and the fact that it admittedly feels out of place in the more grounded reality FMA 03 built. And look, I'm saying this as somebody who kinda still appreciated the sequence. I think it has too many flaws in its presentation and not be seen as a little bit weird. By comparison, Ed's transmutation into a Philosopher's Stone has the issue of not being explained well, and that's it.
Like I said in my original video, the gate plot twist in 03 is nonsensical, but having said that, I think you're slightly exaggerating some of the logical problems with it, namely how early the twist was planted or foreshadowed in the show. And you're forgetting to mention some of the virtues that the Gate plot twist had that the scene of Ed turning himself into a Philosopher's Stone didn't. I think these virtues even things out between the two plot points and justify my initial comparison. Although, like a lot of people, I have issues with the dramatic buildup of 03 Ed entering our reality, 03 didn't only give hints right before the twist itself happened. The audience sees images of our world's history and Ed's memories of the Gate all the way back in episode 29, which is just after the halfway point of the show. Now, I personally don't think hints like this can fully justify a twist of that scale from a dramatic standpoint, but I still think the abruptness of the twist itself is somewhat justified given the purpose of it within 03 Ed's arc and within the thematic arcs of 03 as a whole, because what the Gate twist lacks in dramatic buildup, it more than makes up for in thematic buildup. There's a reason Ed travels to our world and not to some metaphysical realm sealed within the Gate or to some other fantasy sci-fi setting the writers could have conjured up for the finale. 03 is about the conflict between fantasy and reality, between childhood and adulthood, between the ideal and the concrete, between our personal dreams and the needs of the flesh and blood people around us.
A dream to get everything back the way it was. But once you have it, what will you do with your life? The pleasure of a dream is that it's a fantasy. If it happens, it was never a dream.
The show explores these conflicts primarily through Ed's stubborn belief in equivalent exchange, and through his refusal to accept its possible falsehood. When you keep all of this in mind, it makes thematic sense that at the climax of Ed and Dante's argument about equivalent exchange in episode 49, which is really an argument about the fairness of the quote-unquote real world, Ed goes through the Gate to our world, the actual real world, and not only is he stranded in the middle of World War I, often considered the embodiment of bleak disillusionment, but he's also literally stranded in reality itself. This is the thematic justification for the suddenness of this reveal. It's a sudden, brutal reality check. Ed is out of the dream world and then the literal, real world, out of the realm of his dreams and ideals, his beliefs and his ambitions, and in the realm of the ugly price of all of those things. He discovers that the deaths that take place in our world, the real world, fuel the transmutations of his world, the dream world. This is the dark foundational truth of all truths, or it seems like that at first. On the other hand, Brotherhood Ed transmuting himself into a Philosopher's Stone to defeat Pride, whether or not you think that scene is effective overall, has limited thematic significance beyond that moment. Considering everything I just said, the pros and cons of both of these developments even out a lot more than Lunatic the Game says they do.
Specifically, let's look at the flashback Riza has of a conversation with Mustang during the Ishvalan War. What is the intended mood of the scene, and how does the show try to convey that? Well, the flashback delves into Riza's conflicting feelings about passing on her father's alchemy research to Roy, now that Roy's basically used that knowledge to murder countless Ishvalan innocents. So the intended emotion here is heavy, it's haunting, it's full of sadness and regret. How does the scene convey that sadness? Riza kneels in front of a dead child's grave while literal violins play in the musical track as she describes to Roy exactly how she's feeling. There's nothing to pick apart in the scene, because the point of it is practically spelled out for you.
The overall point you're trying to illustrate during the last third of the video is that Brotherhood handles its more mature moments poorly by not being subtle about what it's trying to say, and while I fully understand the criticism when it comes to how characters sometimes explain stuff to each other, leaving no room for the audience to come to conclusions themselves, though I will say I disagree with the idea of this being an inherent issue, as I'd argue it's down to execution.
I never said lack of subtlety was inherently bad. In fact, I even said something along the lines of what you say here.
The problem with this episode, with the early parts of the show in general, and really with a lot of moments after the show supposedly gets great, lies with these cliche choices in execution. I honestly think that the real reason Brotherhood's first leg feels rushed is that its execution is paper thin.
As you can see, I'm not exclusively talking about the first 14 episodes of Brotherhood in this clip, I'm talking about Brotherhood's execution and a lot of its runtime well after that point too. Also, characters in Brotherhood don't over-explain things some of the time, they do it most of the time. That's part of the problem. Now, the next few clips from Lunatic make up the least impressive argument of the video in my opinion. Here he's going to respond to my criticisms of Brotherhood's, in my opinion, ham-fisted approach to storytelling. He's specifically going to respond to the bit where I present a scene involving Riza Hawkeye as an example of my criticism. Not only does he miss the entire point of this section of my video, but he also inaccurately represents certain elements of scenes from 03 that he's going to bring up to support his counter-argument.
I have to say I think your handling of the argument feels poorly put out there, with this section being the best example as to why. Because see, you start off complaining about Brotherhood's handling of Riza venting to Roy after the Ishvalan genocide by complaining about the literal violins that play while Riza buries a dead child, basically spelling out the tone of the scene. But these don't inherently take away from a scene's presentation. I mean, it's a scene that's supposed to be sad, so of course it will be presented with a sad mood through music and imagery.
I think it's obvious from the clip you played that my problem with the Hawkeye scene isn't so much that it uses sad imagery imagery and music for a sad scene period, as it is the specific kind of sad imagery and music that it uses on top of a monologue that describes every molecule of Riza's emotional state. I mean, if my problem was only the use of sad music and imagery to convey a sad tone for a scene, I would dislike almost every work of art on the face of the planet, including O3. Also, while I have huge problems with the non-verbal elements of this scene's presentation, my biggest problem here, and the problem that pushes these other elements over the top, is Hawkeye's monologue, not because I think monologues are intrinsically bad, I just think that there's an art to them, one that Brotherhood largely doesn't understand. I also think your argument has a troubling implication, which is that simply because many movies and TV shows ranging from mediocre to excellent frequently use sad visuals and music in sad scenes, it's hypocritical to single out a bad example of them doing that. From the way you give your argument, there's even an implication that there aren't any meaningful differences in the quality of how various movies and TV shows do this. I want my viewers to keep what I said in mind when Lunatic the Game starts bringing up counterexamples of O3, supposedly doing the very thing I accuse Brotherhood of.
The reason this line from you feels baffling to me is because O3 was no different in this case, unless I'm mistaken. Like, when Ed and Al find Nina's dead body, the rainy atmosphere helps add to the sense of despair they are feeling in the moment.
I repeat, I don't have a problem, and I never said that I had a problem with filmmakers using imagery and sound that's consistent with whatever tone they're going for. Anyways, notice how Lunatic is singling out one element of the Nina corpse scene from O3. This is a problem not only because I listed every aspect of the Hawkeye scene in my original video, but also because if you want to compare the quality of two different scenes from two different shows, you need to see the whole picture of each, not just a piece here and there in isolation. You need to see how all of the pieces work together, so let's be more thorough, break down these two scenes, and consider how all of their components work together. As I said in the original video, the intended emotion of the Hawkeye scene is a bunch of things. It's heavy, haunting sadness, regret, confusion for having given Roy the tools he'd used to commit genocide, as well as conflicting feelings about destroying the results of her father's research forever. But Brotherhood conveys most of these emotions through on-the-nose text. Here's a question: when you remove Hawkeye's monologue, what emotion comes through the non-verbal elements here? I'd argue that it's sadness, and that's mainly it. Listen to this track. Viewers, answer this question honestly. If this was the first time you heard that track, without having watched Brotherhood beforehand, would you have strongly felt the other emotions that Riza must have been feeling in that moment? Now listen to this track from Nina's corpse scene in O3 and ask yourself the same question. What do you get from that track? Do you pick up on just one emotion? Because it seems to me that multiple emotions, maybe like horror, confusion, regret, a sense of failure, and not only sadness, are built into the DNA of the track itself. This music almost feels like it was ripped from one of Wagner's operas, especially in how it uses dissonance to convey intensity and conflicting emotions, and not one dominating tone. In other words, the music here feels multi-dimensional, with its stringed instruments more strongly conveying despair, inner turmoil, and suffering than simple sadness, which is why I don't have a problem with the stringed instruments used here, whereas the violin score from Brotherhood is primarily a tone indicator for sadness. I'd argue it's nothing beyond that. If I'm being honest, the track even reminds me of the meme violin song from SpongeBob, but with slightly rearranged notes, which is why I comedically singled out how lazy the instrument choice was there. As I said in my joke, Brotherhood was using literal violins to convey a one-dimensional type of sadness. This is the most cliched instrument choice for that specific emotion. Yes, significantly more cliched than pianos, because if you ask someone which instrument they'd use to make music parodying pity or plain sadness, they'd probably say the violin or some other stringed instrument before they'd say the piano. Onto the imagery. Yes, there's rain here, and rain is typically associated with sadness and grieving. But what else is here? A chimera's bloodied corpse up against an alleyway wall. This recontextualizes the rain as no longer just sad. It feels like the rain in serial killer movie scenes. By comparison, an isolated grave of a child is super cut and dry. It's supposed to make make you say, isn't that so tragic? There's just not as much to dig into in this imagery. Also, Ed doesn't describe his own feelings in detail here. All we get is a chillingly factual observation from Alphonse about how he thinks Nina died, all building up to Ed struggling to get out the words that he's sorry. When he starts to cry, the cutaway from that feels like the camera can't bear to look at him and has to look away.
When Scar shows Ed the graveyard of all the people killed in Lior during the military's occupation of the city, the cinematography puts into perspective the sheer amount of people killed, while the sunset background adds to, again, the despair Ed feels as the person who opened the door for the military's occupation.
Yes, the storytelling here is clear, but I'd say that it's done with taste. First off, this scene is supposed to make you feel horrified, but the music isn't a stereotypical horror track, it's a stern military theme. In terms of imagery, O3 doesn't just dump the camera in front of these gravestones and call it a day. It replicates the effect you see in live-action movie cameras when they're physically placed far away from their subject, but zoomed way in to make everything feel packed together, all to heighten that sense of claustrophobia you get from seeing the sheer number of these graves so close to each other. This also doesn't feel like lazy emotional manipulation, because while the thought of countless massacred people is dark, it's also intrinsically colder and less personal than the thought of one dead child. And again, no one monologues in the scene about how Ed feels in this situation. Scar is only giving Ed the information he needs to piece what happened together. On top of that, Ed's despair isn't the only emotion he feels here. You see him physically try to reject the truth that Scar is trying to force onto him. There are emotional layers to the scene that are tangibly acted out and shown.
During the ending, when Al sacrifices himself to bring Ed back to life, he sits at the gate and cries while a sad chopping piano piece plays to really illustrate the sadness Ed feels, knowing what Al did just to bring him back.
Alright, this is the worst argument from this section by far, because Lunatic the Game entirely misses the point of this scene, and he's flat out wrong about how it plays out. I'm hoping he misremembered things, because otherwise he's only misrepresenting it for the sake of his argument. In the final gateway scene, Ed doesn't just sit there and cry while the music plays in the background. He doesn't, I repeat, he doesn't shed his first tear until the very end of the scene, and the instant he does, the music stops and the scene is over. You want to know what actually happens while the music is playing? The direct focus of most of this scene isn't Ed's sadness, it's Envy's vengeful hatred of Hohenheim and the horror of his limbs being torn off of him by the shadowy beings that dwell within the Gate of Truth, all as Envy transforms into a fucking dragon, contrasted against the tranquility of the music in the background.
Stop messing with me! You'll do as I tell you! You're taking me to see Hohenheim! To that bastard! To my father!
Meaning this isn't even an example of a sad song being played over a sad moment, it's an example of counterpoint, and any sadness in it is implicit in the background until the very end, mimicking the feeling of tears welling up in your throat on the edge of your awareness, with you only realizing how you feel when it breaks through. This is the dictionary definition of subtle emotional storytelling. Even if you drop the subtlety from it, the only way the scene with its contrasting emotions juxtaposed against each other can be compared to the scene from Brotherhood is if Roy was fucking torching children behind Riza while she was delivering her monologue.
Tell me again, what's so bad about Brotherhood using sad imagery and music to convey a scene's sadness when your beloved O3 does this too?
Again, a lot of movies and TV shows do this. That doesn't mean that the quality of how they do it is the same, or that you can't single out a bad example of this.
Again, I understand that the overall point is that Brotherhood is not subtle and often spends time elaborating characters' feelings or their situations to the audience, but this is the last thing that should have been said here, because all it does is make the rest of the argument look worse.
Why? Because it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about? Look, putting aside my arguments about this scene both then and now, if you actually watch it, Riza does dead-on describe exactly how she feels in that moment. The scene does use a human child's grave to make you feel sad, while the laziest violin score I've ever heard plays in the background. This is exactly what I was talking about, and it's doing each of the things you just mentioned. The fact that you're saying my inclusion of this scene makes my argument look worse on top of your question asking what's wrong with using sad songs for sad moments makes me wonder where the line even is for you. Because even if I found a scene that you agree is executed poorly, it can just as easily be defended by the logic you put forward to defend the Riza Hawkeye scene, meaning it's a useless, nothing argument when it comes to anything related to art criticism. It's just an empty statement.
one moment that, to my surprise, is really beloved, Envy's tearful confession that he's actually jealous of humans. Now, I personally think this reveal fails to hit emotionally. There's no reason to feel anything resembling sympathy to Envy here, because up until this point, he's consistently portrayed as a sadistic sociopath.
Gee, it's almost like that isn't the point of the scene. The scene is presented with a sad tone to it, but I feel it represents the pathetic nature of how Envy goes out. Stripped of all their power, and Ed's pity only serving to come off as him talking down to the bastard from Envy's perspective. He just goes out like a fucking bitch.
I don't even know anymore, man. I mean, it's possible that what he says applies to the manga version of this scene. Okay, so you yourself say that this scene has a sad tone and that it's about how pitiful Envy is at this moment. G-Boy Whiz, isn't pity like another word for something? I just can't remember. Oh yeah, maybe you misspoke here or something, but your other argument here about how this is Ed talking down to him from Envy's perspective, that argument doesn't really matter either because, and here's the mind-blowing thing, we're not watching this scene from Envy's perspective. Most people aren't watching the scene from Envy's perspective. We're looking at this from Ed's, you know, the main character's perspective. And what did he try to do before Envy died, which you didn't mention in the video? He tried to understand, or in other words, sympathize with Envy. He recontextualizes Envy's actions in a way that gives him a more sympathetic motive for doing all the things that he's done, instead of just letting Mustang kill him as a completely incomprehensible monster. Moments before this, we watched Mustang reduce Envy to a helpless, shriveled up, crying thing as Riza and the other humans watch on in horror. Why do you think the writer chose to criticize Mustang here? There may have been a subtler reason for that in the manga, but it's clear that when adapting this part of the manga, Brotherhood chose to emphasize and prioritize the pity and sympathy angle.
Honestly, this is like you looking at Shinji causing the destruction of reality because he was upset, and thinking because the music sounds jovial and upbeat, we're supposed to agree with his action. It only seemed like that if you're not taking into account any of the other aspects of the actual scene.
So not only is there no music in Envy's death scene, which I know isn't the point of what you're saying here, I just want to make it clear to some that I'm not basing my argument on how the music sounded or anything. I just want to get that out of the way. But also the intended tone of the Envy scene is so clear that you yourself have picked up on it. On the other hand, when you look at that scene from End of Eva, on the level of the visuals, and even on the level of the audio outside of the music, there's no possible way to misinterpret that sequence as happy. This whole sequence starts with Shinji having a mental breakdown, followed by him choking Asuka, transitioning from that to imagery of adults choking children, and then right before Shinji murders everybody, he lets out a trademark Shinji Ikari scream, which every single time I hear it is the most horrifying scream I have ever heard. Yeah, you get it, Shinji! No matter how you look at this sequence, it just doesn't have the same effect that you claim Envy's death from Brotherhood has. I mean, not only is Ed the main protagonist and for most audiences the POV character watching Envy with a sad look on his face, but he also gives a whole goddamn monologue describing the human emotion that drives Envy's actions, while other characters in the room observe the homunculus with a sad or serious look on their face. There's no way you can miss that, and the scene ends with Envy fucking crying about how finally, after all this time, someone understands him and humanized him. A human of all things. The End of Eva joke you made, it applies to you, not to me. You're the one ignoring all this abundantly clear storytelling based off of... I honestly don't know what you based your interpretation of Envy's death scene off of. I seriously think you're disagreeing with me just to disagree with me here, because unlike that End of Eva sequence you referenced, there's no glaring song choice or anything else in Envy's death scene that contradicts what I've said about that scene's intent. You know what the real kicker is? This whole sympathy/intention thing isn't even the point of me bringing up Envy's death in the first place. I brought it up as an example of a larger point that I was making about Brotherhood's approach to storytelling. Again, you can even see in Lunatic the Game's own video that this part of my video comes directly after I talked about the Hawkeye scene. I put it there for a reason, because it was another example after the Hawkeye example of Brotherhood's lack of subtlety, and the monologue explaining the whole pathos behind Envy's character is a prime indicator of that. Now, to my viewers who sat through that, oh god, what am I doing with my life? Thank you for sticking with me, but I'm just gonna say this now, I'm not gonna make another response video to Lunatic the Game after this. It's not even a problem with the person I'm responding to. At first I was open to doing more and more responses, but as I spent more and more time on this, look, his response video is around 18 minutes. This video is well, you can just look at how long it is. At a certain point, it's going to be unavoidable for these videos to keep getting longer and longer if we keep responding to each other in a potentially endless chain of videos, at least with the way that I want to handle my response videos. So I'm just gonna bow out, admittedly like a coward, and end this little internet scuffle here. Like everyone else, I have my limits too, and these videos will keep me from doing other videos I'd actually like to do.